sabotage comes from a wooden shoe. Yes, a shoe. And the story behind this English word takes us to France, to factory workers, heavy wooden clogs, new machines, and a famous story that may not be completely true. Stay with me because by the end of this episode, you won't just know where the word sabotage comes from. You'll also learn how to use it naturally when talking about work, relationships, plans, and even your own behavior. Let's start with a shoe. The French word for traditional wooden shoe is sabot, Sabot. For centuries, wooden shoes were worn by working people in parts of France and other areas of Europe. They were practical, strong, and much cheaper than expensive leather shoes. Now, imagine walking around in a pair. They're not exactly light, they're hard, they're heavy, and they're probably not the shoes you'd choose if you wanted to move quietly and gracefully across a room. Keep that image in your mind because it becomes important to our story. During the 19th century, Europe was changing rapidly. Factories were growing, new machines were appearing. Jobs that had once been done by hand could increasingly be done faster by machines. This was part of the Industrial Revolution. For factory owners, these machines could mean faster production and greater profits. But for many workers, the changes could also mean insecurity, difficult working conditions, low wages, and fear of losing their jobs. And this is where our wooden shoe enters the story. According to a famous explanation, angry workers sometimes protested against factory machinery by taking their wooden shoes and throwing them into the machines. Imagine it. A huge machine is running, the gears are turning, the factory is noisy. Then somebody takes off a heavy wooden shoe and throws it into the machinery. The shoe becomes trapped. The machine stops. Production stops. The factory owner has a serious problem. And according to the popular story, this is how we eventually got the word sabotage. It's a fantastic story. There's just one problem. It may not actually have happened that way. And this is where etymology gets really interesting. The history of words isn't always a perfectly straight line. Sometimes a story becomes so memorable that people repeat it for generations, even when the real history is more complicated. Language historians generally connect sabotage with the French sabot, the wooden shoe, but the dramatic image of workers literally throwing their shoes into the factory machines is often treated as a legend rather than a securely documented origin. So, where does the meaning actually come from? One important clue is the French verb saboter. Historically, saboter had meanings connected with making noise with wooden shoes and doing something badly or clumsily. Think about our heavy wooden shoes again. Imagine trying to perform delicate work while wearing them. You might move awkwardly, you might make noise, you might not work very smoothly. From ideas like these, saboter developed meanings connected with doing work badly, damaging something, or deliberately interfering with it. By the beginning of the 20th century, sabotage was being used for the deliberate disruption or destruction of work, especially in connection with labor disputes. And English borrowed the word from French. So, although we should be careful with the dramatic story of workers throwing their shoes directly into machines, the connection between sabotage and the French wooden shoe is real. And I actually think the uncertain part makes the story even more interesting. Because now, when someone tells you sabotage means workers threw their shoes into machines, you can say, well, maybe, but the real story is a little more complicated. And congratulations, you've just become the annoying person at the dinner table who knows the etymology of everything. But at least you'll be an interesting, annoying person. Now, let's move on from history to modern English. What does sabotage mean today? To sabotage something means to deliberately damage, obstruct, or interfere with it so that it doesn't succeed or work properly. And one word in that definition is extremely important: deliberately. Sabotage is intentional. Let's imagine that you're preparing an important presentation for work. You've spent 3 days working on it, then your colleague accidentally deletes one of your files. That's frustrating. That's a problem. You might even be furious. But it doesn't necessarily mean sabotage. Why? Because it was an accident. Now, imagine your colleague is competing with you for a promotion. They know your presentation is important and they deliberately delete the file because they want you to fail. Now, we're talking about sabotage. The intention changes everything. So let's look at some useful expressions you can actually use. The first one is to sabotage someone's plans. This means to deliberately interfere with something another person is trying to accomplish. For example, someone tried to sabotage our plans by giving the client false information, or she thought her former business partner was trying to sabotage her new project. You could also say, nothing is going to sabotage our plans. In this case, you are saying that you won't allow a problem to prevent you from succeeding. Here's another example. Imagine you've planned a beautiful outdoor party. Then it starts raining. Could you say, the rain sabotaged our party? In casual English, you might hear people use sabotage more loosely or humorously like this. But strictly speaking, rain doesn't have an intention. The rain didn't wake up that morning and say, I know what I'm going to do today. I'm going to destroy Sarah's birthday party. So, if we want to be precise, we'd probably say, the rain ruined our plans. But if a person deliberately does something to make your plan fail, sabotage is perfect. Now, let's look at one of the most useful modern expressions with this word: self sabotage. This is when your own actions or behavior make it more difficult for you to succeed. And the interesting thing is that people don't always realize they're doing it. Imagine someone wants to improve their English. They make a plan. I'm going to practice for 20 minutes every day. Great. Day 1, 20 minutes. Day 2, 20 minutes. Day 3, 20 minutes. Then they miss one day and they think, well, I've already ruined my routine. I'll start again next month. That's a form of self sabotage. One small mistake becomes an excuse to stop completely. Here's another example. Someone wants a better job. They see a position that looks perfect for them. They have the experience, they have the qualifications, but they think, I'm probably not good enough. So they don't apply. Again, they may be sabotaging their own chances of success. We can use the noun self sabotage or the verb to self sabotage. For example, I have a habit of self sabotaging when things start going well. Or fear of failure can lead to self sabotage. You'll hear this expression quite often in conversations about psychology, relationships, careers, habits, and personal development. And there's an interesting contradiction here. Sometimes we're afraid of failing, so we behave in a way that makes failure more likely. Humans are complicated creatures. Now, let's talk about relationships. You might hear to sabotage a relationship. For example, he sabotaged the relationship because he was afraid of getting hurt. This doesn't necessarily mean he consciously thought, I am going to destroy my relationship today. The expression can also describe repeated behavior that damages something. Maybe he constantly creates arguments. Maybe he refuses to communicate. Maybe he pushes the other person away whenever the relationship becomes serious. Someone might say he keeps sabotaging his relationships. Notice how naturally the verb works here. Sabotage a plan, sabotage a project, sabotage a relationship, sabotage a career, sabotage your own success. The basic idea stays the same. Something that could succeed is being deliberately or sometimes self destructively interfered with. Now, let's take the word back to the workplace. You may hear the expressions workplace sabotage or corporate sabotage. These describe deliberate actions intended to damage someone's work or an organization's operations. Imagine two companies are competing to launch similar products. Just before one company's launch, confidential information is deliberately leaked. People might investigate whether there was a corporate sabotage. Or imagine an employee deliberately gives a colleague incorrect information because they want the colleague's project to fail. That could be described as workplace sabotage. There's also the passive form, to be sabotaged. For example, the project was sabotaged by someone inside the organization. The negotiations were sabotaged by the leak. Her chances of getting the promotion were sabotaged by false rumors. Notice the pattern. Something was sabotaged by something or someone. This is useful when the result is more important than identifying the persons responsible. Now, here's a quick pronunciation point. Sabotage. Listen again. Sabotage. The final sound is similar to the sound at the end of words like garage in many pronunciations. Sabotage. And notice that the stress comes at the end. Sabotage. Try saying it. Sabotage. Good. Now, let's put everything into a short conversation. Imagine two friends talking about work. One says, I don't understand what's happening with my project. Every time I'm almost finished, something goes wrong. The other person asks, what kind of things? Well, last week, someone changed the numbers in my report. Then yesterday, an important email disappeared. Do you think someone is trying to sabotage the project? I don't know. I hope not. Here, sabotage sounds quite serious because we're suggesting that someone may be intentionally causing the problems. Now imagine a completely different conversation. A friend says, I really want to get healthier, but every time I start exercising regularly, I stop after 2 weeks. You could respond, why do you think you keep self sabotaging? Maybe the person says, I don't know. I think when I miss one day, I feel like I've failed. That's a very different context, but we're still using the same basic idea. Something is interfering with success. Now, I want to test you. I'll give you three situations. Decide whether the word sabotage is appropriate. Situation number one. You're working on your computer and your internet suddenly stops working because there's a technical problem. Sabotage? Probably not. There's no evidence that anyone did it deliberately. Situation number two. A competitor secretly pays someone to damage your equipment before an important event. Sabotage? Absolutely. The damage is deliberate and intended to make you fail. Situation number three. You have an English exam in 3 months. You want a good score, but every evening you tell yourself, I'll just study tomorrow. 3 months later, you barely studied. Could we call that self sabotage? Yes. Your own behavior has made your goal more difficult to achieve. And actually, this is one reason I like this word so much. It started with a very physical image, a simple wooden shoe. Then it became associated with bad or disruptive work. Later, it developed into a word for deliberately interfering with something. And today, we even use it to describe the invisible ways we sometimes interfere with ourselves. That's quite a journey for one little wooden shoe. So let's review expressions from today's episode. To sabotage something means to deliberately damage or interfere with it. You can sabotage someone's plans. You can sabotage a project. You can sabotage a relationship. Something can sabotage your chances of success. In business, you might hear workplace sabotage or corporate sabotage. And when your own behavior gets in the way of your goals, we call it self sabotage. Now, let's go back one final time to the 19th century France. Picture those heavy wooden shoes. Sabot. Picture factories full of new machines. Picture workers whose lives were changing because of industrialization. And then picture the famous scene, an angry worker taking off a wooden shoe and throwing it directly into the machinery. It's a fantastic image, maybe a little too fantastic. Because, as we learned, we don't have to believe that workers literally threw their shoes into machines to understand where sabotage came from. The safer historical explanation is more interesting anyway. The French sabot gave rise to the words connected with noisy, clumsy, poor quality work. Those meanings developed toward deliberate disruption and damage, and eventually, English borrowed sabotage with the meaning we recognize today. That's something worth remembering when you learn about etymology. Sometimes, the most famous explanation isn't the whole story. Words travel, meanings change, stories get added along the way. And occasionally, the legend becomes more famous than the history itself. But now, when you hear the word sabotage, you'll have several connections in your mind. A wooden shoe, a French word, factories and workers, deliberate disruption, and finally, the modern expressions you can actually use in English. And here's today's question for you. Do you think people sometimes sabotage their own goals without realizing it? Maybe you've done it with learning English. You want to improve, but you keep waiting for the perfect time to study. Or perhaps you tell yourself you need to understand every single word before you're ready to speak. Tell me what you think in the comments. And here's a little challenge. Try using sabotage or self sabotage in your answer. That way, you're not just learning a new word, you're actually using it. If you enjoyed discovering the surprising story behind sabotage, save this episode so you can come back to the expressions later and follow English Unlimited for more English listening practice, vocabulary, and fascinating stories behind the words you already use. And the next time you hear the word sabotage, remember, it all started with a sabo, a simple wooden shoe.